The fall of the old order. The storming of the Bastille on that July day in 1789 was more than an attack on a prison. It was the symbolic death of absolute rule. For generations, the common populace had shouldered impossible taxes, unpaid toil, and now the desperation of hunger, while the monarchy and nobility reveled in opulent excess. That era of unchecked privilege was ending. In a converted tennis court, representatives of the common people, the Third Estate, swore a solemn oath to break the king's absolute authority and forge a written constitution. A powerful wave of idealism, championing natural rights and citizenship, was dismantling centuries of tradition. Europe stood on the cusp. A nation forges itself. In the initial, exhilarating weeks following the uprising, optimism in France knew no bounds. Following the tennis court oath, the nation was steered by a National Assembly, a body of elected legislators dominated by middle-class intellectuals of the Enlightenment. This assembly undertook the monumental task of crafting a new constitution, all while managing foreign affairs, domestic policy, and a crippling financial meltdown. Initially, the majority of delegates envisioned a system where a monarch would share power through a constitution. But King Louis XVI and his inner circle viewed this with utter contempt. They had no intention of ceding authority to the commoners and dreamt only of restoring the monarchy's unchecked supremacy. This tension exploded in June 1791, when Louis attempted a secret flight to the eastern frontier, hoping to rally loyalist troops. His capture at Varennes, and his subsequent return to Paris under military escort, shattered the public's trust. The king's profound betrayal deepened the national rift. On one side stood those clinging to the vision of a constitutional monarchy, on the other, a growing chorus demanding its complete abolition and the birth of a republic. By September 1791, a new constitution was finally ratified. The king retained considerable authority and was to preside over a new legislative assembly. However, the government was crippled from within. To the left, the radical Jacobin factions, particularly the Girondins, agitated for deep, systemic changes to taxation, legal codes, and the church's role. To the right, the conservative Feuillants argued the revolution had already achieved its goals. Paralyzed by infighting, many politicians on both sides began to see a foreign war as the perfect solution, a way to reunite a fractured country and achieve their own ambitions. The powder keg of Europe. In 1792, the crowned heads of Europe were far more preoccupied with the fate of Poland than with revolutionary France. The once formidable Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was crumbling. Its greedy neighbors, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, had already helped themselves to its border territories in 1772. Now, in the summer of 1792, Empress Catherine of Russia, alarmed by signs of a Polish revival, ordered her armies to march. Austria and Prussia watched closely, determined to ensure any Russian land grab was balanced by their own territorial acquisitions. For the moment, the chaos in Paris was a secondary issue. Nevertheless, the humiliation of Louis XVI could not be entirely ignored by Europe's monarchs. The principle of divine right was at stake, as was the terrifying prospect that the French infection of revolutionary ideas might spread across their own borders. The previous year, Austria and Prussia had issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, a vaguely worded threat stating that the fate of Louis XVI was a matter of common interest to all sovereigns. Intended to bolster the king's position, this declaration instead ignited fury in France. Revolutionaries saw Austria as a stronghold of reaction, a safe haven for dangerous French exiles, the aristocratic émigrés gathering in Koblenz, who were actively plotting an invasion to crush the revolution. Led by the king's own brothers and cousin, this counter-revolutionary force was already several thousand strong. The call for war became a deafening chorus. Within the Jacobin Club, the Girondins argued that conflict would cement national unity. Some even spoke of a noble crusade to carry revolutionary ideals across the continent. The king and his court, meanwhile, privately believed war would reawaken old loyalties to the crown. In secret, Louis and Marie Antoinette even hoped for French defeat, seeing it as the only way to dismantle the revolution and restore their absolute power. On April 20th, 1792, disaster and disintegration. France was swept up in a fervor of war fever, confident of a swift triumph. But the French army, once among Europe's finest, had been torn apart by the revolution. Nearly half its officers, the aristocratic elite, had fled the country. Those who remained were viewed with deep suspicion by both their enlisted men and the politicians in Paris. The old royal regiments were themselves considered potentially disloyal. They had been hastily reinforced by tens of thousands of eager but utterly untrained volunteers, a citizen army fueled by revolutionary zeal but lacking discipline, supplies, and experience. France's initial target was the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, a wealthy province that seemed ripe for the taking. But the campaign was a fiasco. The aging generals who shared command, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and Luckner, were paralyzed by disagreement. The raw recruits proved dangerously fragile. A minor skirmish near Quievrain so alarmed General Byron that he ordered a retreat, and a mere rumor of an Austrian attack sent his men into a full-scale panic. Another column under General Dillon met an even grimmer fate when his own troops, convinced they were betrayed, shot him and threw his body on a fire. Any hope for a quick victory was gone, replaced by a brewing catastrophe. That summer, Prussia joined Austria in an alliance that would become known as the First Coalition. Together, they planned to invade France, extinguish the revolution, and restore the king's authority. The Prussian forces were led by the Duke of Brunswick, a commander with a Europe-wide reputation for brilliance. On July 25th, he issued a manifesto. If the French royal family were harmed, he would inflict an ever-memorable vengeance on Paris, vowing to raze the city and execute all rebels. Days later, his army crossed the Rhine and marched into France. The manifesto backfired spectacularly. Enraged by Brunswick's threats, Parisian radicals and National Guardsmen stormed the royal palace, the Tuileries, on August 10th. The Swiss guards were slaughtered. The king and his family barely escaped to the Legislative Assembly, only to become prisoners of the radical Jacobins. With the army in chaos, the government in shock, and the enemy marching on the capital, the revolution faced its ultimate crisis, forging a new sword. In the wake of the disastrous invasion attempt, it was painfully clear the citizen soldiers were not yet a match for professional armies. Desperate times called for radical reforms. The French army underwent a rapid transformation. Tactics and unit organization were simplified to suit the new recruits who continued to pour in from the countryside. Heavy equipment and supply wagons were abandoned for speed and mobility. Most importantly, the experienced veterans of the old royal army, once viewed with distrust, were now desperately needed and reintegrated into the ranks. This revitalized force would be far more effective, though a crippling shortage of experienced officers remained. For the moment, only 54,000 French troops under Lafayette and Luckner stood between Brunswick's 84,000-strong coalition army and Paris. The invaders, confident of an easy victory, advanced slowly and methodically. Longwy fell on August 23rd, followed by the crucial fortress of Verdun 10 days later. Panic gripped the capital. Jacobin leader Georges Danton's fiery rhetoric, calling for a terrible war of the nation against the despots, fueled paranoid rumors of an internal plot. The result was the horrific September massacres, where mobs stormed the city's prisons and butchered over 1,000 inmates, including priests and nuns who had refused to swear allegiance to the new state. At the front, the situation was equally grim. Rochambeau had resigned in disgrace. Lafayette, after a failed attempt to launch a military coup, had defected to the Austrians. The new commanders were Generals Kellerman and Dumouriez, both enthusiastic revolutionaries, but untested in high command. The energetic and bold Dumouriez was tasked with blocking the coalition's advance through the Argonne forest. But he misjudged Brunswick's route, leaving the passes poorly guarded. The Prussians outflanked him to the north, routing one of his divisions with a mere 1,500 horsemen and nearly collapsing the entire French army. Dumouriez barely managed to keep his forces from disintegrating. The road to Paris now lay wide open. the cannonade at Valmy. But Kellerman's Army of the Centre, containing some of France's best regiments, had finally arrived to reinforce Dumouriez. Instead of retreating to defend the capital, Dumouriez made a bold decision. He marched his combined force against the rear of the coalition army, threatening its supply lines. Brunswick, unwilling to risk being cut off, was forced to turn back and confront the French. Here, he believed, was his chance to crush this untested revolutionary army once and for all. In the early hours of September 20th, 1792, a dense fog shrouded the rolling hills around the village of Valmy. Brunswick's advance guard clashed with French veterans holding the village of Walloon. These men, from the old royal army, fought tenaciously, buying precious time for the rest of the French force to deploy along a ridge west of Valmy. Surprised by this resistance, Brunswick decided to wait for his main army to arrive. By late morning, the two forces were nearly equal in size, roughly 36,000 Frenchmen against 34,000 Prussians. Both sides massed their artillery, 40 French guns against 56 Prussian. Though outnumbered, the French cannon were expertly positioned on the high ground. Moreover, the French artillery corps, less disrupted by the revolution than the infantry, was a professional, disciplined force, equipped with a superb, standardized Gribeauval system. A tremendous cannonade erupted, the roar of guns echoing across the valley. Dumouriez and Kellerman rode along the front lines, deliberately exposing themselves to enemy fire to rally their men. The French troops responded with a defiant roar, singing the new revolutionary anthem, La Marseillaise. As the deadly artillery duel wore on, it became clear the French would not break. At 1 p.m., Brunswick ordered a general advance. But as the Prussian infantry marched forward, they were torn apart by the accurate French round shot. After advancing only a few hundred paces, Brunswick, horrified by the mounting losses, called off the assault. For the first time in the war, the French had seemingly thrown back the enemy. The battle was not yet over. A Prussian cannonball struck a French ammunition wagon, the massive explosion sending a shockwave through the ranks. For a moment, the gunners froze. A Prussian officer urged Brunswick to exploit the confusion and renew the attack. But Brunswick hesitated. In that critical moment, a young French brigadier, the future King Louis Philippe, galloped up with 2 batteries of horse artillery to reinforce the line. Kellerman himself was on the spot, raising his hat and shouting, "Vive la nation!" At previous engagements, the French had fled at the first sign of danger. At Valmy, they held firm from the royal veterans to the rawest volunteer. As rain began to fall at 5 p.m. and ammunition dwindled, the guns fell silent. A world turned upside down. Valmy was neither a large nor a particularly bloody clash. Casualties numbered only a few hundred on each side. Some historians question whether it deserves the title of battle. Yet its significance was monumental. At the moment of its greatest peril, the French Revolution, a cobbled-together army, a mix of revolutionary fervor and old royal professionalism, had stood its ground and turned back the invasion. The next day, emboldened by the victory, the newly elected National Convention voted to abolish the monarchy and proclaim the French Republic. The Prussians were left to fend for themselves in a hostile and rainy French countryside. Desertion and disease whittled Brunswick's main force down to a mere 17,000 effective troops. He had had enough. His highly trained soldiers were too valuable to waste on a futile adventure. Furthermore, the renewed partition of Poland was a far more urgent priority for his masters in Berlin. Brunswick ordered a retreat. By October 23rd, the last coalition soldiers had recrossed the Rhine, retreating back into Germany. It would take over 20 years and the loss of more than 3 million lives before another foreign army would come as close to capturing Paris as the Duke of Brunswick had done that autumn of 1792.